Before today's video starts, we want to bring you a word from our amazing sponsor, The Ridge. The amazing people at The Ridge have sent me this awesome carbon fiber wallet, and I love it. It's sleek and compact, but it still holds 12 cards, plus my cash. Because of its smart design, I can't keep any junk in my wallet, so now I just carry the things I need. Ridge wallets are also incredibly safe because they have RFID blocking. So it's not a surprise that they have over 30,000 5-star reviews. And the Ridge has so much more than wallets, like this weatherproof backpack. The backpack has an integrated power bank pocket and an exterior USB port for mobile charging. Meaning you can use the backpack to charge your mobile devices. Right now, the Ridge is offering criminally listed viewers 10% off with free worldwide shipping and returns. Just go to ridge.com/listed, that's ridge.com/listed, and use the promo code listed at the checkout. Get the last wallet you'll ever use and help support Criminally Listed by checking out ridge.com/listed. Number 3. Yaser Abdel Said. Yaser Abdel Said was born in 1957 in Egypt. Yaser immigrated to the Dallas, Texas area in 1983 with his mother, brother, and sister. They left Egypt after Yaser's parents got divorced and his father remarried. In the United States, Yaser mostly worked menial jobs. In early 1987, he was working at a convenience store in Tarrant County, Texas. In February of that year, he met Patricia Owens, and within a week, they were married. Patricia was 15 years old at the time. The following year, Patricia gave birth to a son, Islam. That was followed by a daughter, Amina, a year later in 1989, and another daughter, Sarah, in 1990. Yaser was abusive and controlling. In October 1997, Patricia left Yaser, and he did not take kindly to this. As retaliation, he picked up the children at school and drove to Virginia with them. He called Patricia and told her he had taken the children to the Middle East and she'd never see them again. Yaser and Patricia reconciled in March 1998. About 7 months later, in October 1998, Amina, who was 9, and Sarah, who was 8, told their grandmother that their father had been sexually abusing them. They said that the abuse had been going on for 2 or 3 years. When Patricia found out about the accusations, she left Yaser and reported him to the sheriff's department. There was an investigation, and Yaser was subsequently charged with aggravated sexual assault. But then, in January 1999, the charges were dropped. Amina and Sarah had said they had made it all up. They said they had lied because they wanted to live with their grandmother. The family moved around a lot, and they usually lived in squalor. Since Patricia had 3 children under the age of 3 by the time she was 18, she never finished high school. So she generally could only get jobs that paid minimum wage. Yaser would drive a cab or work at a convenience store, but he rarely kept a job for very long. He would often get fired because of his erratic behavior. As his family got older, Yaser continued to abuse his family. At times, he would hurt his daughters to the point where they should have gotten medical help. But their parents wouldn't allow them to seek treatment because Yaser might have gotten in trouble. One time, Patricia tried to leave Yaser and he shot out the tires of her car. So Patricia ended up staying with Yaser. In the autumn of 2007, when Amina became a senior in high school, Yaser started planning his daughter's marriage. Yaser wanted her to marry an Egyptian man because as the father of the bride, he was expecting a big payout from the groom for the honor of marrying his 18-year-old virgin daughter. On Christmas Eve 2007, Patricia was working as a cashier at a grocery store. Amina and Sarah came into the store and they were terrified. They said that their father was going to kill them. Yaser had found out that both Amina and Sarah had boyfriends. The next day, Patricia, Amina, and Sarah and their two boyfriends left the state. They stopped in Kansas and then moved on to Tulsa, Oklahoma. In Tulsa, they rented an apartment. Then a few days later, on New Year's Eve, Patricia made an odd request. It was her deceased mother's birthday, and she wanted to lay flowers on her grave in East Texas. She asked Amina and Sarah to join her, and they agreed to go. It's unclear if Amina and Sarah knew that Patricia had been estranged from her mother years before she died. They had stopped talking because Patricia's mother did not approve of her staying with Yaser. It turned out that Patricia had been lured back to Texas by Yaser. Once they were back in Texas, Patricia told her daughters that she had been talking to Yaser. He wanted to meet and talk to them. Amina and Sarah initially did not want to see him, but then Sarah eventually agreed to go. When they got back to Texas, Amina had stayed at a friend's home. Patricia called Amina's cell phone several times, and when she didn't answer, Patricia went to Amina's friend's home and tried to convince her daughter to meet with her father. Begrudgingly, Amina went home with Patricia. Minutes after they got home, Yaser arrived. He was driving a taxi. Amina got into the front passenger seat, and Sarah got into the back seat. A short time later, at 7:35 p.m. on New Year's Day 2008, the following call came into 911 in Irving, Texas.
What's going on, ma'am?
I'm dying, that's what's up.
Irving Fire Department. Ma'am, are you still there? Ma'am, are you still there? All I've got is she's telling me she's dying. I've got a, why are you still there, ma'am? Ma'am, what is your address? Ma'am.
The dispatcher determined that the phone belonged to a member of the Saeed family. First responders went to their home and they found Patricia there with her son, Islam. They said that Amina and Sarah had gone out with their father, but they didn't know where they went. At around 8:30 p.m., about an hour after the disturbing 911 call, a taxi driver in Irving called 911. He had been parked in a hotel's taxi queue, and the cab in front of him didn't move up when it was supposed to. The taxi driver got out of his own car to talk to the other driver, but there was no one in the driver's seat. In the passenger seat, it sprawled across the back seats were the bloody bodies of two young women. It was the bodies of 18-year-old Amina and 17-year-old Sarah. Using data from cell phone towers, the police believe that Yaser drove to an area near a firing range. He parked the car and pulled out a 9mm handgun. He shot Amina twice at point-blank range, and she died nearly immediately. He then started shooting Sarah. She tried to fight off her father, and she managed to call 911. Yaser ended up shooting her 9 times. After killing his 2 daughters, Yaser drove to the hotel and left the taxi in the queue. After that, Yaser, who was carrying his Egyptian passport, vanished. Since that day, there have been no confirmed sightings of him. It is suspected that Yaser Abdel Saeed is still in North America, and he may have immersed himself in a community with Egyptian ties. Yaser has connections to New York, Texas, Virginia, and Canada. There are no flight records of him traveling to Egypt, but he may be hiding out there as well. At the time of this video, Yaser is 63 years old. He is 6'2" and he weighed 180 pounds. He had black and gray hair and his hairline was receding. He smoked Marlboro Lights 100 cigarettes and he frequented diners like IHOP and Denny's. He may be driving a taxi. In December 2014, nearly 7 years after Amina and Sarah's murders, Yaser was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Over 5 years later, he remains on the list. There is a reward of up to $100,000 for information leading directly to his arrest. Before Yaser went missing, he rarely went anywhere without being armed. The FBI considers him to be armed and dangerous. Number 2. Dennis Melvin Howe. On the afternoon of January 23, 1983, 9-year-old Sharon Morningstar Keenan was playing at a park in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Sometime between 3 and 3:30, a witness saw a man approach her, and then they walked off together. Sharon was supposed to be home by 4 o'clock. She wore a watch, and she was usually punctual. So when she didn't come home at the specified time, her parents became worried. They searched the neighborhood, and when they couldn't find her, they reported her missing. The Toronto police initially dragged their feet when it came to searching for the missing 9-year-old. It wasn't until the next morning that 100 officers started looking for her. Sadly, no trace of Sharon was found. Close to the park were several boarding houses. 9 days after Sharon's disappearance, 2 detectives were going to all the boarding houses to interview the residents. They stopped off at a boarding house that was less than 200 yards from the park where Sharon was last seen. They talked to the resident who lived on the 3rd floor, and he said he had not seen the person who was living on the 2nd floor since Sharon went missing. So the detectives asked the landlord to let them into the apartment on the 2nd floor. The apartment was empty and clean. The detectives looked around for a few minutes, but they didn't find anything of interest. The detectives were about to leave, and then one of them decided to look in the refrigerator just out of curiosity. He later said that nothing specifically drew him to the refrigerator. He said he just wanted to see what was inside. He pulled on the door, but it didn't open very wide because the carpet was blocking the door. The door didn't even open wide enough to trigger the light in the fridge. So the detective looked in the fridge with his flashlight. He noticed a garbage bag and a white shirt. He then saw some human hair. The detective realized he had found the body of Sharon Morningstar Keenan. After she was killed, her body was put into a garbage bag, and then her body was placed inside the refrigerator. The medical examiner determined that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. He thought she had probably been killed on the night she went missing. Immediately, the police issued an arrest warrant for the man who rented the room, Mike Burns. The problem was that no one had a photo of Burns. The only thing the police had was samples of his handwriting, and they made that public. But no viable leads regarding his whereabouts came in. A few weeks later, the Toronto police learned that Mike Burns was not the man's real name. Mike Burns was a man who lived in Regina, Saskatchewan, who either lost his ID or had stolen sometime the year before. On March 5, 1983, over a month after Sharon's body was found, the police uncovered the man's real name. He was 42-year-old Dennis Melvin Howe. Howe was born in Regina, Saskatchewan in September 1940. It is believed that his first brush with the law happened when he was 22 years old. He was arrested for breaking into several homes. For those crimes, he was sentenced to 2 years in jail. In 1965, Howe was back out on the streets. That year, he was arrested and convicted of indecent assault on a young girl. He served a little more than 2 years, and then he was released. On May 30th, 1969, Howe was arrested again for 2 sets of crimes. Earlier that month, he had kidnapped a woman at gunpoint and robbed her. A few weeks later, he threatened a woman with a knife and made her drive him around. He also stole some money from her. He then forced the woman to go into a cafe with him. She threw hot coffee in his face and made her escape. Howe was arrested a short time later. Howe was ultimately convicted of an array of crimes, and he was sentenced to 14 years of prison. Even in prison, Howe continued to be a problem. In April 1977, he escaped from jail and led the authorities on a high-speed chase through Regina. Howe ended up serving about 12 and a half years. He was released on February 17, 1982. He was supposed to be under mandatory supervision, but he took off. 3 days later, he was in Toronto, Ontario. He got a job in a garment factory using the identity of Mike Burns. Howe lived in Toronto for 11 months, and then he left immediately after Sharon was murdered. The last time Howe was seen was the morning after the murder. He was in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, which is over 430 miles from Toronto. He had taken a Greyhound bus from Toronto to Sault Ste. Marie, and he was transferring to a bus heading to Winnipeg, Manitoba. Where he went after that is a mystery. After Howe vanished, one of his brothers made nearly a dozen mysterious trips to Washington State and Montana. His brother was questioned by the police, and he said the trips had nothing to do with his brother. But after he was questioned, he suddenly stopped making the trips. One of Howe's most notable physical traits is that he had bad teeth. So dentists all over North America were sent his wanted poster. One dentist thought he was working on Howe, and he called the police. It turned out not to be Howe, but a different fugitive wanted for an unrelated crime. In 1986, it was revealed that the police don't think that Sharon Morningstar Keenan was the first person that Howe killed. On April 12, 1969, 59-year-old Grace McNeil was found dead on her kitchen floor in her home in Regina, Saskatchewan. She had been sexually assaulted and then stabbed in the throat with a piece of metal. The murder happened about a month before Howe was arrested for kidnapping and robbing the 2 women. Howe was questioned, and he said he wasn't even in Regina on the night of the murder. He said he had spent the night at his girlfriend's grandmother's farm, which is in a village over 30 miles from Regina. But both Howe's girlfriend and her grandmother said he didn't come out to the farm until the day after the murder. When Howe arrived at the farm, he gave the grandmother a pair of commemorative mugs. One of McNeil's friends said that McNeil had the exact same mugs and they were missing after her murder. Also, Howe's girlfriend knew McNeil. McNeil lived across the park from her, and McNeil was the mother-in-law of her cousin. She also remembered pointing out McNeil's home to Howe. The police said that if Howe is ever found alive, they want to question him again regarding Grace McNeil's murder. Several strange possible leads to the whereabouts of Dennis Melvin Howe have emerged over the years. In 1999, the police got a tip that Howe was dead and he was buried in a cemetery in Sudbury, Ontario. It all started 13 years earlier, in 1986, when a man living in Winnipeg named Peter Sanderson had his wallet stolen. He reported the theft to the police and he replaced all his pieces of identification. In 1995, Sanderson had heart surgery, so he applied for health benefits. When he did, the government of Canada said he wasn't the real Peter Sanderson because the real Peter Sanderson had died in May 1988 and he was buried in a pauper's grave in Sudbury. The living Peter Sanderson had served in the armed forces, so the government had his fingerprints on file. They compared his fingerprints to the fingerprints they had on file, and it proved that Peter Sanderson was his real identity, and the dead man had been using his stolen identification. The police soon became convinced that the dead man was really Dennis Melvin Howe. After all, Howe had used a stolen identity before, and he was last seen heading to Winnipeg, where Sanderson lived when his wallet was stolen. In October 1999, the body of the man who used Sanderson's ID was exhumed, and bone and tissue samples were taken. A DNA comparison proved that the man was not Dennis Melvin Howe. The dead man's identity is still a mystery. In 2008, a user posted in the forum unsolvedcanada.ca under the name Van Ringo. Unsolved Canada was a forum where true crime buffs could discuss unsolved Canadian crimes. Van Ringo wrote an odd tale that started back in 1998 when he was watching the television show America's Most Wanted. They showed a segment on Dennis Melvin Howe. Van Ringo, who lived outside of Boise, Idaho, wrote that he recognized Howe. He wrote that Howe was living in a homeless shelter in Boise, and he was using the name Tommy Ross. He had hired Howe to do odd jobs around his appliance repair shop and his art gallery. Van Ringo wrote that when he realized Tommy Ross was Dennis Melvin Howe, he called the hotline for America's Most Wanted and told them where to find him. Van Ringo wrote that a few days later, he noticed two men near his art gallery. He claimed he recognized them from the episode of America's Most Wanted. They were the detectives who had worked on Sharon Morningstar Keenan's case. Van Ringo then speculated that the Canadian and American authorities had conspired together to have Howe killed instead of arresting him. For reasons that were never really explained, Van Ringo thought that they had dropped Howe from 30,000 feet, possibly while nude, so he could think about his crimes on the way down. Another user who was following Sharon's case because he lived in the area when it happened read Van Ringo's post and he became curious. He investigated Van Ringo and he noticed some similarities between him and Howe. They were about the same age, the same height, and they looked similar. Van Ringo also had a connection to Toronto. It was his wife's hometown. So the other user got in contact with the authorities and told them about Van Ringo's post. The police identified Van Ringo as Robert James Miller. He was an eccentric man who owned a cluttered appliance repair shop outside Boise, Idaho. He was also an art collector. He claimed he owned paintings by Van Gogh and Rembrandt. In July 2013, two FBI agents paid Miller a visit. They asked him a lot of questions, and they asked to see evidence that he really was Robert James Miller. Miller cooperated with the investigators by answering all their questions and giving them all the evidence they requested. He swore he was not Dennis Melvin Howe. He said he had never even been to Canada. He was married to a woman who grew up in Toronto, but they had met in California. It took 2 years, but the FBI finally concluded that Miller and Howe were not the same man. The authorities in Canada are still looking for Dennis Melvin Howe. He may be using the aliases Michael Burns, Wayne King, Ralph Ferguson, or Jim Myers. He has short, crooked fingers and he's left-handed. When Howe went missing, he smoked and drank heavily. He had bad teeth and a small gap between his front teeth. One of his more noticeable quirks was that he tended to call people turkeys. At the time of this video, if Dennis Melvin Howe is still alive, he is 79 years old. Many people do not think he is alive. Before Howe went missing, he spent most of his adult life in prison. Had he been arrested in North America in the past 30 years, a fingerprint or DNA check would have alerted the Canadian authorities because they have his fingerprints and his DNA on file. Could Howe have stayed completely out of trouble after killing Sharon? Regardless, the police would still like to know what happened to Howe after he fled Toronto. No matter how old Howe is, the authorities think that, if he is still alive, he should face justice for what he did to Sharon Morningstar Keenan. Number 1. Taylor Morris Teaford. On the night of July 18, 1967, 39-year-old Charles Culpepper was driving with his mother in Madera County, California. Suddenly, a woman ran out of a house and flagged them down. She screamed she had been shot and her brother was trying to kill her. Charles got out of his car and 6 gunshots rang out. Charles was shot once and his car took 5 bullets. Charles's mother was unharmed. Charles managed to get the injured woman into his car and they drove off. The woman was 26-year-old Sherry McIntosh. Her brother, 32-year-old Taylor Morris Teaford, had been drinking and then he snapped. Using a .22 caliber handgun, he shot to death their 72-year-old grandmother, Pearl Teaford. Sherry's 9-year-old daughter was there that night, and when the shooting started, she ran to a neighbor's home and the neighbor called the sheriff's department. Sheriff's Deputy Kit Herring arrived on the scene, and when he stepped into the yard, Taylor opened fire on him. Herring was shot, but he managed to return fire. When he did, Taylor ran off into the mountains. Sherry McIntosh, Charles Culpepper, and Kit Herring all survived their injuries. A search of the area was conducted, but Taylor Morris Teaford was gone. Taylor had just been released from prison 4 months earlier. He had served about 10 years for breaking and entering and rape. After the shooting, Taylor managed to stay off the police's radar. In September 1968, over a year after the shooting, Taylor was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives. But this still did not lead to an arrest. It's suspected that after the shooting, Taylor got a job in a logging camp in Northern California. He may have also got a job on a ranch somewhere. He was proficient with many types of firearms, and he liked to hunt and fish. Taylor was Native American, and he had black hair and brown eyes. He was about 6 feet tall, and he weighed about 170 to 190 pounds. Taylor was muscular and lifted weights. When he was a child, he contracted polio. This left him with a noticeable limp in his right leg. Taylor was a heavy drinker, and he also did drugs. He had a violent temper, and many people in the neighborhood were afraid of him. Finally, according to the authorities, Taylor was addicted to violent sex, including bondage. On October 2, 1969, 13 months after Taylor Morris Teaford was placed on the FBI's most wanted list, a woman was found dead in the St. Louis Hotel in Oakland, California. She had been strangled with a piece of cloth, and she had been punched in the face several times. The woman has never been identified. It is strongly suspected that she was a sex worker. She was possibly new to town, or she was passing through. It is believed that she was between the ages of 16 and 21. She had brown hair and brown eyes. She was about 5'5" and weighed 105 pounds. It is suspected that she was a drug user because she had needle marks in her arms. Several witnesses saw the woman go into the room with a man. They identified that man as Taylor Morris Teaford. It had been nearly 2.5 years since he killed his grandmother and shot 3 other people. The police thought it was plausible that Taylor was the killer because he had been convicted and served time for rape. Also, Taylor was supposedly heavily into bondage and violent sex. It's also suspected that the Jane Doe found in the hotel room was the victim of a serial killer. The first suspected murder happened about 6 months earlier. On April 10, 1969, the body of a dead woman was found beside a dirt road near the Oakland estuary. She had only been dead for a few hours. Her head had been smashed with a 30-pound chunk of concrete. Using her fingerprints, she was identified as 25-year-old Judith Lattaker. She was a sex worker with no fixed address. 4 months after that, another woman's dead body was found. This body was found in the Berkeley Aquatic Park. Her face had been beaten and her throat had been slashed. She was identified days later as 27-year-old Alma DeRuff. DeRuff was a sex worker and a drug addict. Then, a month later, the Jane Doe was murdered in the room at the St. Louis Hotel. It's also suspected that the killer had one victim who survived. She was a 24-year-old sex worker and heroin addict. She had been working in downtown Oakland, and a man driving a station wagon picked her up. He then took her to some waterfront. He told her to undress, and she refused to without being paid first. He punched her several times in the face and then showed her some photographs. He said that he had killed the women in the photographs. She remembered that one of the photographs showed a woman who looked like she was dead, and she was lying in the back of the station wagon. The man then put the photographs away and kept humbling her. She managed to get out of the car and she got some help. The man drove away. The woman later said she saw the man again. She said she saw him at the St. Louis Hotel on the same day that the Jane Doe was killed. However, the newspaper reports did not say if the man she identified was Taylor Morris Teaford. That being said, the only thing that connected Taylor to the murder of Jane Doe is that witnesses saw him at the hotel on the day she was killed. Also, Taylor fits the description of the killer. The serial killer was described as tall and husky, he had an explosive temper, and he had a crew cut. Taylor, who was a convicted sex offender, was 6 feet tall, muscular, and he was known for his violent temper. Also, Taylor had a full head of hair, so it's possible that he had a crew cut. However, the vague description of the serial killer could describe any number of men. There's no physical evidence that proves Taylor was a serial killer, or that he was even alive or in California at the time the 3 women were murdered. In June 1972, for reasons that were never made public, the federal process against Taylor was dismissed. As a result, after 4 years, he was removed from the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Taylor Morris Teaford is still wanted for the murder of his grandmother in July 1967 and the murder of Jane Doe in October 1969. If he is still alive, he is 84 years old at the time of this video. Thank you so much for watching today's video. We hope you found it interesting. If you're looking for some new videos to watch, why not check out my new channel, Chapter Dark, and see if you can solve the mysteries in the videos. If you like riddles, puzzles, or escape rooms, Chapter Dark will be right up your alley. A link to Chapter Dark should appear on the screen momentarily, and you can also find a link in the description box below this video. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, we'd really appreciate it if you gave us a thumbs up. Please also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Roku. The links are in the description box. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching, and please stay safe.